Hello, everybody. Welcome to another ICC episode. This is Daniel Bagiri, your host. It is an honor for me to have Mr. Dimitri Lascaris here on our show. Dimitri is a renowned lawyer, journalist, and activist. Graduating from University of Toronto, Faculty of Law in 1991. He began his legal career at Sullivan and Cromwell, representing major financial institutions at Wall Street, including Goldman Sachs. He later co-founded and led Canada's top security class action team, recovering over $450 million for investors from 2004 to 2016. Currently, Dimitri is based out of Montreal, and he has helped secure $126 million worth of settlement in 2022 Can Trust case. Dimitri was named by Canada Business Magazine as one of the 50 most influential persons in Canadian business. Canadian Business Magazine described Dimitri as a fiercest legal advocate for shareholder rights. And in 2023, Dimitri was nominated as one of the 25 most influential lawyers in Canada. Dimitri, it is an absolute honor to have you on our episode. And you know what? I don't think my introduction even does justice to you. I'm gonna open this conversation up by giving you some space and introduce yourself to our audience, telling us how you got involved in this work, what draws you towards advocacy, and maybe we go from there.
Thank you, sir, first of all, for the very kind words and introduction, Daniel. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. I guess there's a lot of things I could say in terms of how I ended up doing the work that I do today, but I think it has a lot to do with my being a child of immigrants from Greece who came over to Canada in the 50s. And what prompted them to do that has always had a profound impact on me. That my mother and father were born and raised in a village in the south of Greece. They were born in the Great Depression. They lived through the Nazi occupation of Greece, and then after the Nazis were driven out of Greece, primarily as a result, or certainly in large part as a result of the work of the communist resistance in Greece. Churchill and Stalin entered into a deal to basically divide up their spheres of influence in Europe. And Stalin agreed that Greece would come within the British sphere of influence, and Churchill ceded Yugoslavia essentially to the Soviet sphere of influence. And so at that point, Churchill had a free hand to wreak havoc in Greece. And what he basically did, his government, was they provoked a civil war because they didn't want the communists to come to power. That civil war is also something that my parents lived through. And after the war ended, Greece lay in smoking ruins, and this was in the 1950s, and the Canadian government was looking for cheap labor.
Right.
At that point in time, they weren't quite ready to welcome people from the global south. So they looked to the south of Europe where, basically the Europeans living there were viewed as second-class citizens, Greeks, Portuguese, Italians. And they invited them,
Right.
encouraged them to emigrate to Canada, even providing them free passage on, maritime transport from Northern Europe to Halifax. And that's how my parents came to Canada. And when they came, they had no money. They had no high school education, not a single year of high school education. And they didn't really want to come. It's something that I learned very quickly as a child. They came because of economic hardship. And they were very sad to leave their country. And also when I was born in the 60s, Canada actually was not an easy place for people from Southern Europe. There was a considerable amount of bigotry towards, Greeks, Italians. I experienced that myself numerous times when I was a kid. Now, of course, we're fully integrated. I don't believe that we're subjected to any kind of discrimination in any meaningful way. Now that discrimination is targeting people primarily of non-European origin. Overwhelming. Indigenous peoples, of course, continue to experience horrendous discrimination. Peoples of the Muslim faith, peoples of Arabic origin, people from Latin America, Africa, of course. So, we have it relatively good. Those of us who came over from Southern Europe, or the child of immigrants from Southern Europe. Uh, but nonetheless, all of this kind of over the course of my life really kept me focused on Canadian foreign policy, issues of inequality, discrimination, racism have always meant a great deal to me. And when I finally got to a point in my legal career where I was not really in need of making money anymore, because as you mentioned, I did have a successful career as a class actions lawyer. I just
Correct.
I decided to, I had an obligation to use my good fortune to help people who were, the victims of oppression, particularly oppression involving my government, the government that purports to speak in our name. Um, and so that's what I've been doing for the last 8 years. That's been the primary focus of my activity. And to be honest with you, Daniel, I find this far more fulfilling than any work I've done in my life, any other work that I've done in my life. It's
That's fascinating.
the most meaningful work that and I feel very blessed to be able to do it.
Well, yeah, and it's just taking you quite far. I mean, I see you on different networks, but also working with activists on the ground. You do the work that most reporters don't are not willing to do. And you come from a legal background, but again, I think it's that motivation. You have that personal story that comes with your advocacy. You mentioned how you have your family history, moving to Canada, going through immigration. Um, I think that what makes you really special. The fact that you were willing to go to. I mean, I saw you in Lebanon recently. Where you were in Lebanon, I think, weren't you? Just
Actually, yeah, 4 times I've been to Lebanon since this genocide began in October of last year in Gaza.
and so that's going from you're doing multi-million dollar or you're still doing multi-million dollar class lawsuit action, and there's considerable amount of money. It's so very it's very interesting for many people that you're willing to even risk, you put yourself on the line, risking even potentially your career, your money and whatnot, fighting for what you might consider the truth or object, justice. Uh, and you mentioned it's worth it. Can you expand on that? Like, you know, I mean, how do you overcome this anxiety, this fear that many people might have when it comes to standing up for justice, things like social justice and
Mhm.
inequality and racism?
Uh, you know, fear, I don't know. I mean, it's a funny thing. I wouldn't say, and I'm not, please don't think that I've got like, there are people all over the world who are exhibiting vastly more courage than I have or ever will. I
Right.
met a lot of those people when I was in Lebanon. These are people who every day are putting their lives on the line, really seriously putting their lives on the line for justice. So I even, I appreciate you, um, your comments about, overcoming my fears, but I really feel that the dangers I confront are very modest compared to what these other people have to deal with. But nonetheless, I don't really feel fear because I just, how can I put this? I feel that I've lived a life that is very, uh, I've been privileged in many ways, even though I came from a very humble background. I've experienced all the things that I really wanted to experience in my life. And as a result, uh, if they, if I lost my life tomorrow, if my life came to, I'd love to live another 20, 30 years, don't get me wrong. I'd love to live until, I'd like to live forever, as long as I was physically capable of
Sure.
the work that I love, and that my mind was functioning, and I was reasonably healthy. So, but at the same time, if for any reason my life ended tomorrow, I wouldn't feel that I hadn't accomplished what I wanted to do in my life. So, for what I don't really. If I would be afraid if I thought that I hadn't been given that opportunity yet, then I would be afraid. But because I have had the opportunity, I've been fortunate to be able to take that opportunity. I don't. I just. And I would even go so far as to say that if I died in the cause of justice tomorrow, that'd be
Mhm.
a pretty good way to go. We all have to go sometime. So why not go out in the cause of justice?
Wow. Wow, that's that's amazing. That's a quote we're going to use. Dimitri, uh, now tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now with the with the public inquiry here in Canada. You mentioned that I mean, you might maybe even tell us a little bit if your work with ICC, Iranian Canadian Congress, and what are you doing right now in terms of advocacy here in Canada?
Well, on the foreign interference, let's talk about that first.
Correct.
The ICC was granted intervener status in the foreign interference inquiry, and just it's important to sort of understand how this whole inquiry came about. What
Please.
happened was that the Trudeau government was apparently presented some time ago with so-called evidence by CSIS that the Chinese government in particular was aggressively interfering in Canadian politics. And as I understand it, a close advisor to Trudeau looked at the so-called evidence and pretty much decided that it was a nothing burger. There really wasn't much there.
Hmm.
CSIS was upset about this. CSIS was absolutely convinced that the Chinese government was hell-bent on perverting the course of Canadian democracy. And so a part of this, by the way, is me piecing pieces of evidence together, right? So
Right.
others may disagree. This is my view about how all of this happened. So some people within CSIS went to Robert Fife of the Globe and Mail, who is
Mhm.
basically a mouthpiece for the military industrial complex in Canada.
Mhm.
He's even been awarded journalism awards by the, military contractors.
Of course. Yeah.
So they go to him and they leak information to him, which suggests uh, that the Trudeau government is disregarding or is flouting its responsibility to protect Canadian democracy from foreign interference. So at that point, all hell breaks loose. The opposition parties, particularly the Conservatives, and the media went after Trudeau big time when these leaks happened. So under pressure, Trudeau decides to do a few things. One of the things he managed to accomplish was he got the parliamentary committee that is charged with looking after national security to publish a report it had compiled on foreign interference.
Mhm.
Okay. It was an 84-page report, and they ended up publishing, I think it was in June, and it was very heavily redacted. But
Correct.
it was at least more information than the public had at that point. And the other thing he did was he just set up this inquiry. So this inquiry is really the result of some political shenanigans involving CSIS and so forth. And so the ICC comes along and says we'd like to participate, and the court gave them very limited status. They, as an intervener, they were able to make submissions in writing, but they couldn't question witnesses, cross-examine witnesses. They couldn't call witnesses. They couldn't give sworn testimony.
Wow.
And in that capacity, they asked me to represent them, and I did so on a pro bono basis. And the thing just concluded, the second phase. And what's interesting is that it happened in two steps.
Right.
The first stage resulted in the report by the commissioner, who's a judge or was a judge of, I believe, the Quebec Superior Court. That report was issued in May. And the report that will emerge from the second phase, which just concluded, has not yet been published. I would imagine that's going to be published sometime in the next few months. And the first report she put out, and by the way, I wasn't involved at that stage. I became involved in between the first phase and the second phase on behalf of
Right.
Iranian Canadian Congress. But the first report she puts out, she goes, "Oh yes, there's evidence of foreign interference and so forth." But she says at the same time that this foreign interference had no impact on the last two elections, and that Canada's democratic processes remain robust. That was the
Right.
word she used. So this really didn't jibe. Her conclusion really didn't jibe with what CSIS was telling the media.
Right.
You know, and so I myself have read, both reports. Her report. I've read the parliamentary committee's redacted report twice, and
Mhm.
I'll tell you, Daniel, I don't see a scintilla, not a scintilla of credible evidence that China, the usual suspects are China, Russia, and Iran.
Right.
They are the three objects of the ire of Western governments, right?
Correct.
And not because they care, Western governments care about the human rights of the people living in these countries. They couldn't care less about the human rights of the Russians and the Iranians
Of
and the
course.
Chinese. All they care
Right.
about is power. And these three countries pose a problem for Western hegemony in the world. So, anyways, I don't think they have produced yet an iota of credible evidence that any one of these governments is exercising or even attempting to exercise any meaningful influence over Canadian politics. There is plenty of evidence that other governments are staring us in the face, particularly the governments of the United States and Israel.
Right. Right.
But they don't want to talk about that. So this is why I call this whole thing. This is my word, by the way. I'm not. This is not the word of the Iranian Canadian Congress. So I just want to be
Right.
clear. The comments I'm making in this interview express my own point of view. They don't necessarily reflect the views of the ICC. But I've been calling this a scam from day one, ever since I read these reports, because I think that this, for these very reasons that I've just discussed, there's no credible evidence that the Chinese, Russian, or Iranian governments have interfered in any meaningful way in Canadian politics or democracy, so assuming we have a democracy. But there's plenty of evidence that our so-called allies are doing that, and nobody wants to talk about that.
And are these reports public, Dimitri? You mentioned that they've been made public, correct? Is there any way people can access them to read the report for themselves?
Sure, you can get the commissioner's report in the foreign interference inquiry on the website of the inquiry. They have their own dedicated website. And the parliamentary committee, the Government of Canada website, you can find, you just go to the list of committees in
Right.
Parliament, you find the National Security and Intelligence Committee, and you click on that, and you'll find the report. Scroll down until you get, I think it was in June, it was issued, and you can find it there. And one other thing I want to say about that parliamentary committee report, which is very important to know, I
Hmm.
mentioned that it's heavily redacted, right? Because
Yes.
they always, this national security information, and we can't compromise our sources, all the normal nonsense about why they don't show us the so-called evidence. Well, someone in Canadian politics actually did read the unredacted report.
Right.
A number of people did, and one of those persons was Elizabeth May, who's the leader of the Green
Ah,
Party. So, and I have my issues with Elizabeth May, as many people know, but nonetheless, that's another matter. Elizabeth May goes through the whole process of getting security clearance so she can read the report, because only if you have security clearance can you read this report. And
correct.
she can't tell people what she read in the report. She can't disclose the details of the classified information she read in the report. But she did this interview for the Hill Times after she read the unredacted version of the report, in which she said, what's in that report is not really evidence. Okay. It's, there's a lot of conjecture. And she mentioned, that CSIS has been dishonest in the past. For example, in the case of, I think it was Maher Arar. Okay. And there's certainly many other examples of CSIS being dishonest. So she was basically saying, without getting into the details, she herself says she believes there's foreign interference. She says it's a serious problem. But she admitted in this interview that that unredacted report doesn't really contain evidence. And this is significant because Elizabeth May, by training, is a lawyer.
Right. Of
She
course.
was, so she knows a thing or two about evidence, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, even the unredacted report doesn't have evidence in it. I mean, this is just, it's a total scam, in my
Well,
opinion.
and so that's very interesting because, I mean, obviously you're a lawyer and other lawyers have looked at this. As you mentioned, there's no evidence of foreign interference, specifically by those three countries, I mean, the usual suspects. But it doesn't really stop the big media conglomerates just going out there publishing day in, day out. I mean, when I saw the media, for example, Global Mail, BBC, and you see these reporting that keeps repeating the same line. It's reminiscent of the Russiagate issue with Trump a few years ago, where there's this accusation of Russian foreign interference in U.S. politics. Uh, why do
Which
you
is a
think it is?
total hoax, a complete and utter
Well,
hoax.
but the problem is like people believe them because the media, seems to repeat the certain lines that seem to repeat themselves across all of the major media, corporate media out.
Absolutely.
Well, why do you think that is? Why do you think the media feels, or maybe they don't have a choice? Maybe they just repeat the lines of the deep state or the government itself. Why do you think the media keeps repeating the same lines that they've been fed?
Well, the media organizations are owned by, controlled by billionaires,
Uh,
the wealthiest members of our society. And they have a vested interest in Western hegemony. Okay. They profit enormously from Western hegemony. They want to see countries like China and Iran and Russia disempowered, maybe even completely and utterly destabilized, dismembered, so
right,
they can go in there and they can basically steal their resources, which is what they've been doing for centuries. These
wow,
Western elites, right? They just, all they
mhm,
want is their resources. And they want to have complete domination of the peoples, the indigenous peoples of these regions. Uh, so this is this obsession, which you quite rightly point out the Canadian media has with this allegation of foreign interference by the usual suspects, is really reflective of their agenda, which is to profit themselves by disempowering and destabilizing any country that has resources and whose government refuses to do the bidding of Washington. And so within the organizations, these are people at the top of the media organizations. And so what they do uh, is two things to ensure that the content of their media are consistent with their agenda. One of the things they do is they only hire people who think like them. So if
right,
you're a journalist, you want to work at the Globe and Mail, you're not going to get a job there if you're a radical leftist or you're an anti-imperialist. Forget about it. You have to think like Robert Fife or Stephen Chase, these two
mm,
award-winning journalists. That's how you get a job at the Globe and Mail. That's how you get a job at the National Post. Now, if anybody happens to step out of line, they are punished directly or indirectly. They might lose their jobs. They might get demoted. They might get assigned to some, subject matter which is really uninteresting, like
right,
local bike paths or something like that. But they will
right.
have consequences, and people in the media business in this country know that perfectly well. So if they're not perfectly ideologically aligned with the billionaire owners of the corporations, they live in fear of losing their jobs. And so they just repeat this garbage. It's just complete and utter garbage. And what's really interesting, Daniel, is if you look at polls showing what Canadians care about, you'll not find any which puts foreign interference anywhere close to the top of the list of the things people are care about. People care about inflation. People
Right.
care about the healthcare system. People care about war. They care about the debt of the government, their own personal indebtedness.
Right.
Nobody, no poll shows that Canadians, ordinary Canadians, attach nearly as much importance to the subject of foreign interference as the corporate media and the political elite. It's
And our
ridiculous.
warmongering doesn't help either. It seems, I mean, the more we beat the drums of war, it doesn't really help our economy. It doesn't really suit the average Canadian. It doesn't really make a change for them. Um, so it seems like a vicious cycle of big money, deep state, and groupthink that's really leading the narratives.
That pretty much sums it up. Yeah.
Well, and that this brings me to, some of the more recent events. We see, for example, the claims of assassination over Irvin Cutler with the Canadian
Yeah.
government. Can you tell us a little bit? Because, I mean, what that's when foreign interference, gets to a point where there's threats of assassination of our, let's say, politicians. Oh, that's something else. That then there you can claim that the Canadian government had, or the CSIS people, even though they might be dishonest, they might have some rights. They say, well, these guys are threatening to assassinate our politicians.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about this particular story, the Irvin Cutler story. Are those claims of assassination valid?
There's no evidence to back it up, and I don't trust Irwin Cotler. Why should anybody trust Irwin Cotler? Irwin Cotler has devoted almost his entire life's work to promoting the agenda of Israel. The
Mm,
man is a Zionist fanatic, and Israel hates the government of Iran. So he wants to see The United States, I have no doubt that Erwin Kotler wants to see the United States and other Western countries drawn into a full-blown war against Iran. So anything he can do to build public support for hostility, belligerence, military action against Iran, he's going to do it, no matter how baseless or silly the claim may be. He's trying to work up, and so I think this is very much the agenda of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. This is why they spread this crap about foreign interference. They want the public to support, increased military spending, hostile military actions, economic sanctions against these countries,
Right.
whatever it takes to destabilize them, weaken them, bring about regime change. They're trying to build support for that. And I believe that this claim that the Iranian government wanted to assassinate Erwin Kotler is all part of that effort, of demonizing Iran so that the public will support military actions and further economic sanctions against Iran. Now, is it possible? Is it theoretically possible that the Iranian government planned to assassinate Erwin Kotler? Sure, it's possible. Lots of governments engage in political assassinations, and probably nobody does it more than the governments of Israel and the United States, by the way, our
Mhm.
close allies. They are the masters of political assassination. Um, so I'm not sitting here and telling you that I know for a fact that the Iranian government didn't do this. I acknowledge it's possible, but there's absolutely no evidence to support it, no credible evidence at all. And furthermore, the government and Erwin Kotler have a motive to lie for the
Mhm.
reasons that I just stated. Um, and the other thing is, frankly, Daniel, it doesn't make any sense. Okay, I don't understand why the Iranian government, which is in the middle right now, it's really on the cusp of a full-blown war against the United States and Israel, is going
Right.
to concern itself with this 84-year-old political hack, Erwin Kotler, who doesn't even occupy, he's not even an MP, let alone a minister of the Canadian government. He's
Right.
he's basically a geopolitical pipsqueak. Nobody outside of Canada and Israel, almost nobody talks about Erwin Kotler or cares about Erwin Kotler. The
Okay.
Canadian establishment loves to hold him up as this champion of human rights, sure. And he's, a lot of people in Israel, the Zionist element of the population of Israel, a lot of them know about Erwin Kotler and admire Erwin Kotler, but he has real no influence on the global stage. So why would the Iranian government devote its resources to trying to take out Erwin Kotler? That really doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And
And it
until
doesn't
the
it
evidence
doesn't
to
make
back it
sense to
up,
me either. Yeah. Well, that's what it's very shocking. I mean, but also it gives like I mean, you might say it gives too much credit to Iran. I mean, how could they be driving so many different assassination attempts across United States and Canada, and then not really without them have given us the real evidence? Like, where are they getting these evidence from, other than words of some people or hearsay and
and what would they gain by doing it? Like, honestly, do we believe they're so stupid as to think they would gain anything by killing Erwin Kotler? They would gain absolutely nothing. Nothing. Because Erwin Kotler doesn't exercise any power or influence. And whether he's alive or not alive isn't going to change the Canadian government's policies towards Iran. It is
Sure.
going to continue to be hostile to the Iranian government, irrespective of whether, Erwin Kotler is around.
And so it's interesting we talk about human rights. Has Irvin Kotler or any other major human rights organization affiliated with the government, have they been calling out what's now the ongoing genocide in Palestine or the events in Palestine?
Erwin Kotler has been defending the genocidal regime. He has not uttered one peep of criticism and continues to, smear people who call it a genocide and who condemn the regime's leadership for what it's doing, for the horrors it's perpetrating. He continues to, claim that Israel is acting in self-defense when anybody with a conscience can see that that's patently false. It
Mhm.
is exterminating as Amnesty International just concluded. This is a Western mainstream human rights organization,
That's right.
concluded that Israel is committing genocide. Okay. Multiple human rights experts have. The ICC has issued arrest warrants.
Correct.
So, the ICJ said it's plausible back in January. Okay. It's now much more obvious Israel's committing genocide. Back in January, they said it was plausible that Israel's committing genocide. What has Erwin Kotler done? this so-called champion of human rights, he's continued in every conceivable way to defend Israel and has not articulated a peep of criticism. This man is an affront to the human rights community. He's an insult to human rights activists. To call him a human rights activist, that's an insult.
Right. So it's interesting you bring up the ICC, and of course the ICC, International Criminal Court, has recently passed this indictment or arrest warrant against the heads of the Israeli state. And Justin Trudeau came out. He said that he would support that ruling. In other words, he would comply by the Roman status. Can you talk about that? Talk about the significance of the ICC case and what it could mean for us here in Canada?
Yeah, so I just want to clarify one thing about what Justin Trudeau said. Justin Trudeau never said that he would arrest or have Netanyahu arrested if he stepped foot on Canadian soil.
What did he say?
He said, we will respect the decisions and the regulations of the international tribunals. That's
Correct.
what he said. Now, the same thing was said, by the way. This was like, it's amazing how much leaders of Western countries sing from the same song sheet. Whenever they're confronted, like they have a coordinated response. We heard essentially the same thing coming from the government of the United Kingdom, which is sending weapons to Israel to commit genocide.
Right.
We heard the same thing coming from continental European governments, but none of them actually said that they would arrest Netanyahu or Gallant if they came to their countries. I think we are being fed a rancid pile of BS, if you'll excuse my French.
No, of course.
I don't think that Justin Trudeau doesn't even have the courage to impose an arms embargo on Israel. Does people actually think that man is going to have the courage to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel? I believe that's a pipe dream. He isn't going to do it. That doesn't mean that Netanyahu will come here, because Netanyahu still has to be worried that some independently minded prosecutor is going to tell the police to go arrest him, right? But would Trudeau order the arrest of Netanyahu? No way. I don't believe it for 1 second.
Yes.
Nonetheless, the existence of these warrants, you talk about the larger significance. It's very important, very important. It's a stigma that will haunt Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant for the rest of their lives, and the state of Israel. This is a blemish that they will not be able to remove ever.
And yes, exactly. And of course, but Canada is a party to the the Statute of Rome, which makes a party to ICC.
Correct.
Legally speaking, wouldn't Canada be liable for not carrying out its duties under international law?
Yes, 100%.
But in other words, our political class don't really care.
Who's going to hold them accountable? The problem with international law is it doesn't have an effective enforcement mechanism. So, look what happened with the ICJ. The ICJ issued various orders towards Israel. Israel basically gave the middle finger to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, repeatedly. The means by which the orders of the ICJ are supposed to be implemented or enforced is action by the UN Security Council. But when it went before the UN Security Council, the United States repeatedly used its veto to protect Israel. And so people like Justin Trudeau and other Western so-called leaders who probably will not enforce the ICC arrest warrants, they know that, at the international level, there's nothing that can really be done to hold them accountable, to enforce the law. Now, that's one of the reasons why, people are pursuing actions through domestic courts, including here in Canada against the Trudeau government, because the domestic courts can enforce the law.
Right, exactly. I mean, technically, we're supposed to have an independent judiciary. Is that not correct?
Yes, and police, and they're supposed to, when courts issue orders in this country, the police must comply, and they generally do.
Right. Well, that's good. That's good. But speaking of international law, we often see how Western governments cite international law and human rights. In particular, the case of Libya comes to mind, and Syria comes to mind, of course, with the right to protect doctrine when there is grievous crimes against humanity that's being conducted. Western governments make the argument that they have a responsibility to intervene, much like they make the case for Syria, which has been going through this ongoing civil war since 2011. I wanted to get your opinion on this. What we're now seeing, and I guess we're shifting the conversation a little bit because we're coming up at the top of the hour too.
Yeah.
The situation in Syria. We saw, I guess, al-Nusra Front, but I guess they changed their name. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that because you've been to the region. You have tremendous experience in the Levant and in West Asia. So I wanted to just get your take on what's going on now with the sudden uprising in Syria and how Western governments are responding to that and potential, let's say, if there's a potential response from the Syrian government, and how are they going to frame it? Is that going to justify, further Western interference by Turkey, by NATO members in that country, driving the civil war into maybe a situation where the Syrian territory is going to become divided between different factions even more. I want to get your take on that really quick before we close the session.
Well, the main force that is now attacking Syrian cities that were under the control or are under the control of Assad is the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham movement, which used to be called the Al-Nusra Front, as you mentioned.
Right.
And I think it was around 2017, because it wasn't particularly good for their image in the West, they rebranded and they became HTS. But these people are violent, radical extremists who have committed some of the most heinous imaginable atrocities in Syria and elsewhere in the region of West Asia. And the reason why they changed their name was so that, the next time they tried to destabilize the Syrian government, their sponsors in the West, which basically means the US government, Israel, and other Western governments, would be able to claim more credibly that they are freedom fighters and that they're seeking to bring democracy to the Syrian people. But the reality hasn't changed. They are extreme, violent Islamic radicals. In fact, I think personally, I'm not a Muslim, but I think that they are an affront to the values of Islam.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is what they characterize themselves as. In any event, they are backed by Turkey. They have been centered in the Syrian city of Idlib, which is near the Turkish border. There was basically a peace deal that was done, temporary arrangement, which kept them in that little corner of northwestern Syria on the Turkish border. And Erdogan, during the time that deal was in effect, this is not unlike what happened in Ukraine after we had the Minsk Accords. What he did during that time was he built them up into a formidable fighting force. And he received some help in that regard from the Ukrainians, who had developed a lot of expertise in drone warfare.
Right.
And so after training them, he decided to use this force. I'm sure that this was coordinated with the US government and with Israel at the very moment when a ceasefire went into effect in Lebanon. Literally the next day, they launched this attack. So this timing is not coincidental. And now they have seized, it appears, all or substantially all of Aleppo, which is the second largest city in Syria. And today, this morning, I read a report, sadly, that they seem to have captured or in the process of capturing Hama, which is further to the south of Aleppo. And if you look at the direction their forces are going, it's clear what they're trying to do, which is exactly what Israel wants. They're trying to create a barrier to the transfer of weaponry from Iran through Iraq and Syria into Lebanon to rearm the Islamic resistance, which is the military wing of Hezbollah. That's what they're trying to do. This is exactly what Israel and the United States want them to do. And they're basically a proxy of Israel and the United States, with Turkey's complete complicity and cooperation. So I don't think that they're going to succeed. I can't say with a high degree of confidence they won't, but just judging from the reactions of the Assad government's supporters in Iran and Russia in particular, and also Iraq, there are militants who are coming across the border from Iraq, Shia militants, to support the Assad government. And already Russia has begun relentlessly bombing these lunatics.
Right.
And so I think at the end of the day, probably they're going to fail, but they're going to
Right.
kill a lot of people in the process. They are going to cause immense suffering. And again, you can trace all of this back to Washington and Tel Aviv and
Right.
to Ankara. So one lesson we should take away from this is that Recep Erdogan is a complete and utter fraud. All of his fiery pro-Palestinian rhetoric is nothing but kabuki theater. That
Yeah.
man is clearly aligned with the United States and Israel.
And it seems like most of the Arab states follow likewise. I mean, it seems like when they, in terms of their doctrine, when it comes to their speeches or how they talk to their media, they seem to present one thing, but when it comes behind closed doors, like for example, shipments of oil and fuel supporting essentially the genocide in Palestine or um, you know, and it's very unfortunate because the fundamental victims of these wars or war crimes and crimes against humanity are Arab people themselves, Muslim people themselves. And it's a wonder for me, why would countries like Turkey, most of the Arab states, be behind closed doors supporting colonial narrative? I mean, I have my own opinion. I want to get your take on this too.
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between what people in the street believe and feel. In countries like Egypt and Jordan, there was a poll in Saudi Arabia, I think about 6 or 7 months ago,
Mhm.
showed that over 90% of Saudis wanted Saudi Arabia to rupture all diplomatic relations with Israel.
Wow, it's tremendous.
Huge number. So, but the leaders of these so-called leaders of these countries don't care about their people. They never did. These are people who are only interested in their own wealth and power. And the United States government has compensated them richly for doing the bidding of Washington. But it's interesting. There's been some evolution this time around in the attitudes of certain Gulf states, and particularly Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia appears to have taken a stand this time, whereas, when the Syrian war erupted back, I think, in 2010, 11,
Hmm.
it was absolutely on the side of the so-called rebels and
Right.
wanted to see Assad out. But this time around, they're not siding with the Turkish-backed jihadists.
Interesting. That is
They,
interesting. Yeah.
and they've let Assad back into the Arab League. And the other thing that the Saudi government hasn't done, well, it entered into a détente with Iran, which China
Of course.
mediated, which
Hmm.
was that was an amazing development, came out of the blue
Correct.
for me. Uh,
Hmm.
and also, they have refused to allow their airspace to be used to attack Iran. And they more or less have entered into an uneasy truce with the Ansar Allah movement in Yemen.
Right.
I think the Saudis have begun they're sophisticated enough to see that power is shifting in the world. It's shifting
Right.
away from the West. It's not because they're good people.
Right.
The- these are tyrants. These are murderous tyrants in Saudi Arabia who run that country. Uh,
Hmm.
but they're sophisticated enough to see that power is shifting to Asia, and that Iran is a serious player and probably a much more powerful country in some ways than Saudi Arabia is, particularly
Right.
its missile technologies. And so they're kind of, I think, right now, kind of playing both sides of the fence. The Saudi autocracy, they're
Hmm.
trying to stay friends with everybody, which is an important development. And I think we're going to see more of this in the future.
Absolutely. Well, that's yeah, these are some hope, I suppose. Um, One final question, Dimitri. You know, under face value, we seem to be, we have this anti-Islamist, let's say, anti-Islamist militancy in our in our narratives here in Canada. Why would we support fundamentalists, militants like this? I mean, we have a track record of, you going back all the way to the Soviet era in Afghanistan, fueling jihadists everywhere we go, particularly Sunni jihadists. And these folks end up, you know, not only destroying the image of Islam, demonizing Islam, as you mentioned, but also incurring tremendous harm on the local people, local indigenous people, whether they be Christians, Jews, Shia Muslims, minorities. Why would we do that? Don't we see that this is going to come back and hurt us eventually? You know, we create all these refugee crises in West Asia, North Africa. You look at Libya, for example, you know, and we're creating radicalism across the region. And then at the same time, we're pointing the blame toward all those Muslim countries. That those are the problems.
Yeah.
It just seems like we're shooting ourselves a little bit in the foot here.
Well, when you say we, I take it you're referring to our governments, not to
Correct.
ordinary
And the
citizens.
Western countries in general.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. So, well, Western governments, I think the lesson of the last few years, and particularly the last year, is that our governments are run by people who are depraved psychopaths. Just say it straight up. These people are psychopaths.
Hmm.
I was very critical of Western government foreign policy before this genocide began, but even I never imagined, Daniel, that, 13, 14 months into this horror show where Israel has been committing genocide and bragging about it, basically bragging about it. Its
Right.
soldiers publishing on an almost daily basis evidence of their war crimes on social media.
That's right.
I never imagined that we would continue, even now, to be, shielding them from legal accountability, sending them weapons, avoiding imposing sanctions upon them,
Right.
continuing to accord them trade benefits under free trade. I never imagined that. This has been quite a shock to me, and I think we have to come to terms with that as citizens, because if in fact I'm right, and these people are psychopaths who have absolutely no conscience, no human decency, it's not just the Palestinian people who are at risk. They
So
are to a primary, it's all of us. We are all at risk. And in fact, we are all at risk. Look at what they're doing. They're escalating the war in Ukraine to the point where
yes,
we could find ourselves being incinerated in a nuclear holocaust.
correct.
So we need to understand that removing these people from power is not simply in the interests of the indigenous peoples of West Asia. It's in all of our interests. We need to find people to represent us and to govern us who have a fundamental commitment to human decency. These people do not, I'm afraid to say.
That is a very frightening thought. So that is frightening indeed. I mean, you were talking about nuclear holocaust essentially, and uh, having people like that, as you mentioned, leading us towards the cliff essentially, and we're sleepwalking almost as if we're not even realizing how close we are to that kind of destruction.
No.
Um, but I want to, you know, we're coming up here to the top of the hour, but I want to end on a positive note. Dimitri, how would you, I mean, our community, let's say our community here in Canada or immigrant communities, minorities, even Iranian Canadians, and we're faced with tremendous pressures. You know, in the media, we're constantly demonized. You know, you're constantly afraid of not speaking out because, you know, if you speak out, well, you're a terrorist. If you speak out, you'll be branded as a certain way. What is your message to the community in general, to the broader advocacy community? Of course, you know, the legal, the you know, lawyers have done some really phenomenal things in the past.
Mm.
How could we move forward from here and provide a solution in the face of what seems to be a really frightening possibilities of annihilation?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say that I'm actually, despite my dire warnings, I actually am optimistic.
Good.
It's not. I'm telling you how I honestly feel. How
Of
I
course.
honestly feel is that there is a massive shift in geopolitical power happening. That the era of U.S. Western hegemony is over, and that that's a good thing. That there are going to be numerous power centers around the world, and people are going to be forced to, at the governmental level, cooperate. My concern is that things spin out of control before this new multipolar world matures and becomes stabilized, and we're going to find ourselves in a nuclear war. That's my concern. That's a real danger. But
Right.
assuming we can avoid that, and I think we probably will.
Mhm.
I think we're heading towards a better world, and I think it's going to happen in my lifetime. So I just want to be very clear about that. But in terms of what people can do, I'd say two things to you. First of all, there's strength in numbers. Okay, so the more of you, the more united you are, and the more numerous you are, the better able you will be to fend off those attacks, the attacks against your reputation, the attacks against your livelihoods. Now, if you don't want to take those risks, there are ways in which you can contribute in very important ways without exposing yourself to those risks. And the number one way to my mind is BDS.
Mhm.
It's a very powerful tool if enough people are boycotting these products. The choice is, if you make a choice not to buy products or services of corporations that are complicit in these crimes, there's really no way for anybody who's, engaged in a witch hunt against supporters of the Palestinian people to
Correct.
identify you as a member of the movement, right? You can do that quietly. You can do it privately, and you can speak to people in your own inner circle. You don't necessarily, although I would encourage you to promote the BDS movement on social media. If you don't want to be public about it, you go to people in your own inner circle, people you trust, and you say, look, I understand these corporations, there's been a list compiled. I've made a decision. I'm not buying these products or services. I urge you to do likewise. And just privately and quietly help build support for the BDS movement. That can make a real difference while at the same time keeping you out of the limelight.
Everyday forms of resistance, small
Ab-
but mighty.
Absolutely. And
Excellent. Go
enough
ahead.
people do the BDS thing, that can have a devastating impact on these criminals.
Of course. Dimitri, I want to thank you very much. There's a lot to talk about still. Maybe in future episodes we can have you on again. But I want to thank you again, once again, for your advocacy, for your work, and I look forward to our future collaborations. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having me.